Okay, well, I don't know whether some of you, when you saw the name Michael Slater up on the programme, thought it might have been this guy who was going to be up on stage today. Well, if you did, I'm sorry if you're going to be disappointed. I'm definitely not a famous Australian cricketer. That's one thing I'm not. I'm a British occupational hygienist. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I think a lot of people, when they get to a certain age, thanks for the age bit, Kate, starts thinking about where they come from, what their origins was. I certainly did. So a few years ago, I started to think about my family tree. And these are some of my family, some of my great-grandparents. The young girl sitting at the front, that's my grandmother. The four older women at the back, the young women at the back, are her sisters. And coming from Lancashire, in that part of the 20th century, not surprisingly, a lot of them worked in the cotton mills, where they were exposed to a lot of health hazards. One of those being noise. Noise in the cotton mills, the levels were typically in the 90s, sometimes even 100 dBA. And not surprisingly, that led to a lot of people, including my grandmother and my mother, who both worked in the mills, developing serious noise-induced hearing loss. There are other problems too. This lady, she's kissing the shuttle. Might seem a strange thing to do, but it was common practice. It was the way they used to get the thread loaded into the shuttle. That presented problems, for example, like transmission of infectious diseases such as TB. But also, because the shuttle was contaminated with oil, as indeed were other surfaces in the mills, there was a risk of cancer of the mouth. And this young man with bare feet also at risk of cancer of the feet from contact with the oil-soaked floorboards. And of course, there was the dust. Exposure to cotton dust, particularly in the early stages of processing, can lead to the development of bicynosis, a really serious respiratory disease. It's an allergic condition, sometimes known as Monday morning fever, because people used to suffer the symptoms worse on a Monday. They get better during the week. The worst dust levels and the highest incidence of bicynosis was in carding, where people used to, with the process which was straightening the fibres ready for spinning. And the incidence of bicynosis in carding rooms was typically about 60%, and in spinning about 20%. Now, the pioneers of occupational hygiene in the UK did a lot of studies on dust levels and looked at improving the working conditions and dust levels in the mills and contributed to improvements. I wouldn't like to have used the dust sampling equipment, though, particularly if you thought you might want to do some personal sampling. Things have changed. The industry's gone in Lancashire now. The mills have all closed. They've either been demolished or converted into other uses, or lie derelict. But there's still a demand for cotton goods. So the work has gone. It's gone to countries like China, India, Pakistan, and other countries in the developing world. But the conditions in those countries tend to, and the working practices as well, tend to be rather primitive in many cases. And controls are unknown. And what we can see, if we study what's going on in these countries today, is a return to those diseases that were prevalent in the past. We're seeing those old industrial diseases re-emerging. So, for example, studies in Pakistan and Ethiopia showed that workers in the mills there was an incidence of, or rather a prevalence of bicynosis in carding of up to 80% and 40% overall. Similarly with noise, levels very similar to old 20th century Lancashire in the 90s and exceeding 100 dBA sometimes. And again, real risk of development of noise-induced hearing loss in those countries. Now, William Blake, the famous English poet, in 1804 wrote about the dark satanic mills. And that term was a good description of the condition even when my ancestors were working in the mills in the 20th century. And it's certainly a good description of many of the workplaces in the developing world. This is how many people die every year from occupational disease and accidents at work. In fact, it's probably an underestimate. And it doesn't take account of the many tens of millions who suffer from occupational diseases that are not fatal. Behind every one of those statistics is a human being like my ancestors. And even though some occupational hygienists may take an academic interest in this, I think the majority of people in this room have a real determination, a real passion about improving working conditions and preventing ill health. We've got the skills to stop problems like that, to solve problems like that. There's a challenge for our profession now to make sure that those skills are available where they're needed.